Her name doesn't matter, and that's the point. She lives in a village in the hills of Gyeongsang-do, and every morning for as long as anyone in her family can remember, she has climbed the same slope to a small garden behind her house. On her porch sits a clay ongi pot. It has been refreshed and fed, batch after batch, for more than 40 years. Doenjang, fermented soybean paste, made the way her mother made it and her mother's mother before that. She has never in her life bought a bag of frozen fried chicken. She has never kept a bottle of soda in her kitchen, not because someone told her not to, because it was simply never part of what her table looked like. I want to be direct about who she is. She is a composite, an illustrative figure built from a documented population pattern, not a specific person I'm naming and verifying. But the pattern she represents is real, and it's been measured. Here's the gap that makes this worth 20 minutes of your time. Her grandchildren, one province over in Seoul, eat fried chicken and instant noodles several times a week. Same country, same genetic pool, same healthcare system. And when researchers actually went looking at what happens inside the body when a Korean diet shifts from her plate to theirs, the numbers were not subtle. A national health survey in Korea, the Korean National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, tracked over 4,700 adults and sorted their eating patterns into groups. One group followed what researchers labeled the traditional pattern, built around rice, vegetables, and kimchi. Another group followed what they labeled the meat and alcohol pattern, built around processed meat and heavy drinking. When they compared the two, the meat and alcohol group showed a 33% increased risk of elevated blood glucose, a 21% increased risk of elevated triglycerides, and a 21% increased risk of elevated blood pressure compared to the traditional group. That's not a vague East versus West platitude. That's a measured gap inside the same country, published in a peer-reviewed nutrition journal. And it's the numeric backbone of everything I'm about to walk you through. Because here's what's counterintuitive about this video. It's not really about 5 magic foods to add. It's about the small, specific list of things the longest-lived people in Korea consistently did not let onto their plate, and what the research says happens in the body when you remove them. We're going to go through this in 3 layers. The first is the most visible and the easiest to act on today. The second is where most people get the mechanism wrong. The third is the one that surprised even the researchers who found it, because it wasn't about restriction at all. The first thing they avoid is processed meat and fried protein, and this is the layer where the villages didn't get healthier by discovering some rare ingredient. They got healthier by simply staying still while the food system around them changed. A separate study looked specifically at what researchers called the meat dietary pattern, high in processed meat and fried poultry, using National Health Survey data. Korean men in the highest quartile of this pattern had 1.47 times the prevalence of metabolic syndrome compared to men in the lowest quartile. And there's a detail buried in that research that I think is the whole mechanism in miniature. Korean poultry consumption used to be mostly boiled. That was standard through around 1990. By 1998, the majority of poultry eaten in Korea had shifted to fried preparation. Same chicken, same protein, different verb. And that single shift in cooking method turned a lean, low-risk food into a major source of saturated fat in the national diet. This is worth sitting with because it means the food itself often isn't the villain. The preparation is. Boiled protein and fried protein are not biologically equivalent, even when the base ingredient is identical. Frying adds oxidized fats and calorie density that boiling and stewing simply do not introduce. The grandmother in the hills wasn't avoiding chicken, she was avoiding the fryer. Here is what Tier 1 looks like in practice. This week, take one meal built around fried or processed meat and swap it for the same protein prepared boiled, steamed, or stewed. A boiled chicken and vegetable soup instead of fried chicken. a stewed pork instead of processed sausage. The protein stays, the preparation changes. That single swap is where the measured risk difference in the research actually lives. You now understand the first and most visible layer. What comes next is the layer where health-conscious people, the ones already trying to eat well, get the mechanism backwards. The second thing they avoid is refined grain and added sugar. And I need to be precise here because this is where most nutrition content misleads people. It is tempting to hear traditional Korean diet and assume the lesson is avoid carbohydrates. That is not what the data shows. In fact, it shows almost the opposite. One analysis comparing a Korean balanced diet pattern built around beans, fish, seaweed, vegetables, and fermented foods against a westernized pattern built around noodles, bread, meat, soups, and fast food found the westernized pattern raised the risk of abdominal obesity and metabolic syndrome. So far, that sounds like a simple traditional good, Western bad story, but a separate dietary pattern study complicated that picture in an important way. Researchers also identified what they called a traditional carbohydrate pattern, one that was specifically high in refined grains, potatoes, sugar, and sweets. And that pattern, despite carrying the word traditional in its name, was also associated with higher abdominal obesity risk and higher triglyceride levels. Read those two findings together, and the actual mechanism becomes clear. It was never about carbohydrates as a category, it's about refinement. White bread, instant noodles, sweetened snacks, and processed starches behave very differently in the body than intact grains do, regardless of which culture's grocery store you found them in. The contrast case comes from a large cohort study inside the Korean Genome and Epidemiology Study, which followed over 58,000 adults over the age of 40. Researchers there looked specifically at hansik, the traditional Korean dietary pattern built around multigrain rice, along with fruit and nuts. Higher adherence to that multigrain, minimally refined pattern was inversely associated with metabolic syndrome risk. Same starting point, rice is the staple, but whole and multigrain rice behaved in the body in the opposite direction from refined starch and sugar. The mechanism runs through the same glucose pathway you would expect. Intact, minimally processed grains release glucose slowly, which means insulin does not have to spike sharply to manage them. Refined starches and added sugars behave almost like a shortcut straight into the bloodstream, forcing a sharp insulin response meal after meal for decades. So here's Tier 2 in practice. Look at what's actually on your plate this week and find the most refined item on it. Not carbohydrates broadly, the most refined ones specifically. White bread, instant ramyeon-style noodles, a sweetened packaged snack. Replace it with a multigrain rice or a whole grain and vegetable-based version of the same meal at least 3 times this week. You're not removing rice, you're changing which version of rice is on the table. You now understand 60% of this system. What's left is the layer that isn't really about avoidance at all, even though it started this entire video with the word avoid. The third thing, and this is the one that surprised the researchers who found it, is skipping the daily fermented staple, not eating too much of something, failing to keep one specific thing present every single day without exception. Researchers studying the diets of Korean centenarians ran into something unexpected. On paper, a heavily plant-based, largely vegetarian-leaning diet should carry a real risk of vitamin B12 deficiency, since B12 in nature comes almost entirely from animal sources. So investigators expected to find exactly that deficiency in the Korean centenarian population. They didn't. When they went looking for why, they traced a meaningful share of B12 intake back to traditional fermented foods, specifically Doenjang and Cheonggukjang, along with seaweed. In other words, the fermentation itself was quietly filling a nutritional gap that the rest of the diet structure should have left open. That's not a minor footnote. That means the fermented staple wasn't a garnish or a flavoring choice. It was functionally load-bearing in a way researchers didn't anticipate going in. A separate study looked even more directly at the biology underneath that finding, comparing the gut bacteria of centenarians living in designated longevity villages in South Korea against other age groups. Doenjang consumption specifically was positively associated with a distinct fecal microbiota composition in that centenarian population, the kind of composition researchers associate with a more favorable, lower inflammation gut environment. And there's a third piece of this same picture from the broader Korean centenarian study, a nationwide, multidisciplinary research effort tracking centenarians across the country. Researchers there found that centenarians living in mountainous regions scored higher on measures of dietary diversity than centenarians living near the coast. Not restriction. Diversity anchored around a consistent fermented staple. Put those three findings together and the shape becomes clear. It was never one dramatic elimination. It was one small, non-negotiable daily presence, Doenjang, or a similarly fermented, unprocessed staple, sitting underneath a genuinely varied diet every single day for decades. So here's Tier 3 in practice. Keep one fermented, unprocessed food, a Doenjang-based soup, and unsweetened traditional kimchi present on your plate daily, not occasionally. Treat it as a base ingredient of the meal, the way rice is a base ingredient, not as a condiment you reach for once in a while. Now here's the moment where I want you to see all three tiers at once, because this is what actually convinced me this pattern was worth building a video around. 3 separate research efforts run by different teams using different methods on different slices of the Korean population all point in the same direction. The National Health Survey data on blood glucose, triglycerides, and blood pressure. The dietary pattern research separating refined carbohydrate risk from whole grain protection, and the centenarian and microbiome research on fermented staples. None of these teams set out to prove the same thing. They converged on it independently. A minimally processed, fermentation-anchored, refined carbohydrate-light pattern outperforms the westernized alternative on measurable markers inside the same country, the same genetics, the same hospitals. And there's one more piece of national data worth knowing, because it tells you this pattern is not a fixed relic of the past that's disappearing no matter what anyone does. National survey data tracked the prevalence of the westernized dietary pattern in Korea declining between 1998 and 2010, while a healthier, lower sugar pattern doubled in prevalence over that same period. That's a population moving in a direction, which means this is a chosen pattern, not an inherited one. It can be built and it can be walked back toward, one plate at a time. Here's the one thing to do today, because that's how change actually happens, with one thing, not 5 at once. Open your kitchen and find the most fried or processed protein you'd normally reach for this week, and prepare it boiled or stewed instead. That's it. That's Tier 1, Day 1. If you want the fuller structure behind this, the way I have laid these 3 tiers out with weekly shopping lists and swap templates adapted for a Western kitchen, that is exactly what the old world table protocol walks through tier by tier, the same way we just covered it here. Subscribe to the channel if you want more of these deep dives into the sourced research behind the world's longest-lived populations. And tell me in the comments which of the 3 tiers is already closest to how you eat right now. One word is enough: